The first time I saw those pictures gathered in one place, the room was almost completely dark except for the bluish glow of the monitor. The air was dry and stale, smelling of old paper plastic and burnt coffee, the kind of smell you only get in an evidence room that's been closed up all day. On the screen in front of me, a single pine tree filled the frame, its trunk rough with age, its lower branch bending out like an arm holding back the fog. I clicked forward, and another image appeared, almost identical. The same needles catching the same flat gray light, the same mist hanging in the background like breath on a cold window. Every time I tapped the mouse, the picture changed, and didn't change a slow flicker of sameness that made the skin along my neck tighten. The only movement came from the tiny shifts in light and shadow, and the faint hum of the computer fan pushing warm air against my wrist. Behind me, metal shelves full of boxes stayed quiet, and the fluorescent fixture overhead buzzed just enough to remind me it was there. I remember thinking that it felt less like looking at photographs, and more like staring into a kind of held breath that had gone on far too long. Let me know where you're listening from, and hit follow if you think remembering is its own kind of justice. Back then, before any of that, my life was a lot smaller than the stories people tell about it now. I had my little house on the edge of Redford, a single-story place with aging cedar siding, and a front porch that always smelled like wet leaves once the rain settled in for the season. Most mornings I woke before my alarm to the sound of trucks on Highway 7 and the soft hiss of tires on wet pavement. I'd stand at the kitchen window with my first cup of coffee, watching the fog sitting low over the tree line, the Douglas firs and pines rising out of it like they were slowly climbing out of sleep. The light in that part of Washington in late October doesn't come in all at once. It bleeds in gray and patient, sliding across the river and up the hills one window at a time. By the time I shrugged into my county jacket and stepped onto the damp porch, there'd be a faint smell of wood smoke in the air from the older houses where people still used stoves to take the edge off the cold. The sheriff's office sat a block off Main Street, a squat brick building with aluminum-framed windows that rattled whenever a logging truck went by. I knew all the sounds that place made. The clack of Sheriff Kellerman's boots down the hallway before he'd even opened the door. The faint squeak of the radio on my desk whenever dispatch leaned back in her chair. The little groan the coffee maker let out whenever someone tried to squeeze one more pot from grounds that had already given up. On a normal day, our calls weren't anything anyone would make a documentary about: minor fender benders on the highway, a bar fight at the Grizzly Tap, a lost hiker who always turned up at someone's cabin, cold and embarrassed. Redford had its share of trouble, but it was ordinary trouble, the kind that came with too much alcohol, not enough money, and long winters. The town itself sat in a shallow valley Main Street, running east to west, like a line drawn between the river and the first rise of the mountains. The asphalt always looked a little damp, even on dry days, and the storefront windows carried a permanent film of fine dust from the old mills upriver. Maggie's place, the Rusty Mug Cafe, sat on the corner where Main met the road up toward the trailhead, its neon coffee cup sign flickering faintly in the mornings. If you pushed that glass door open just after dawn, the bell over the frame would jingle, and you'd get hit with the smell of bacon, burnt coffee, and whatever cinnamon roll Maggie decided to overbake that day. The regulars' loggers, a couple of mail carriers' off-duty deputies, sat in the same seats they'd sat in for years, the legs of their chairs scuffing the same grooves into the cracked linoleum. It was in that world that the name Evan Rhodes first drifted across my desk, not as a headline, not as a face on a missing poster, but as a line on a fax from the Forest Service. The paper was still warm from the machine when I picked it up, smelling faintly of toner and something chemical. A naturalist photographer out of Portland, it said, had applied for and received the usual clearance to work in a protected area of Silvercrest National Forest near the Redford Ridge Trail. Commercial shoot, environmental calendar, no special restrictions beyond the standard ones. We saw those permits from time to time: film students, travel, writers, the odd documentary crew, when someone in Seattle wanted a shot of authentic small-town America. I initialed the bottom to show the sheriff I'd seen it set it on the corner of my desk next to a cooling cup of coffee and didn't think much more about it. I saw Evan in person a day or two after that, though I didn't know his name yet. It was early the kind of morning where the air at street level felt colder than the air above your head, and the low clouds had settled into the alleys behind the storefronts like they were taking a rest. I had stopped into the Rusty Mug for a refill, and there at one of the side tables by the fogged-up window sat a man with a camera bag on the chair beside him and a small notebook open on the table. He had that look I've seen on people who work outdoors for a living, skin a little weathered eyes always moving toward the nearest doorway of sky. Maggie set down a plate with a sandwich in front of him, and he half listened to whatever she was saying, while his fingers traced routes on a folded map. Every now and then he'd glance toward the window, watching the way the light shifted on the wet street as a pickup rolled by. His hands were steady, but there was a kind of hum in the way he sat, like his mind was already out past the town line up in the trees. That afternoon back at the office, I ran into Sheriff Kellerman in the hallway near the copy room. He had the forest permit sheet in his hand creased now where he'd folded it into his pocket. "Your photographer's in town?" he said, nodding toward the direction of Main Street. His voice always carried a bit of gravel, like he'd swallowed wood smoke years ago and never quite cleared it. "Seems harmless. Environmental folks, city accent, big camera. You know the type." He handed the paper back to me and went on toward his office, the scent of rain and cold air following him in from the doorway. I tucked the sheet into our permit file, just another name in a cabinet full of names belonging to people who came and went without leaving so much as a scuff mark on our town. On the far edge of Redford, out where the pavement began to crumble into gravel, sat the Evergreen Lodge. Its siding had once been white, but by 2013 it had taken on the gray-green tone of everything that sits too long in damp air. At night the sign hummed and buzzed the word Evergreen, glowing a tired green over a row of pickup trucks and the occasional out-of-state rental. Inside the lobby smelled like lemon cleaner laid over old carpet and coffee that had been sitting on a warmer since before dawn. Jenny worked the front desk most days, flipping through a crossword when the place was quiet. The phone cradled between shoulder and ear, her voice soft but efficient as she took reservations from people who wanted something close to the mountains, but not too rustic. Evan checked in there, of course. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it later from Jenny, who remembered the way he'd stood for a moment in the lobby, just listening to the rain on the motel roof before he signed the registry. He'd come in late after the dinner crowd from town had already drifted home, his jacket damp at the shoulders and his boots leaving dark prints on the thin rug by the door. He asked about breakfast hours, about how early the coffee was put on, whether there was a quiet place nearby to sit and look over maps before first light. Jenny told him he could walk down to the river overlook, not far, just a short stretch of asphalt, and then gravel where the town lights fell away, and you could hear the water moving below. He thanked her, his voice low and even, and she said later that he had that particular kind of politeness that comes from spending a lot of time alone. Silvercrest National Forest loomed over all of this not just as a place on a map, but as a physical presence you felt in your chest when you stepped outside. On overcast days, the ridgeline looked like a dark wave that had frozen in place just before it washed over the town. The trees there were old, older than any building on Main Street, their trunks thick and rough, their roots pushing up through the soil in slow, patient movements. You only noticed when they cracked a trail or shifted a rock. The forest had its own sounds, the far-off rush of the river, the occasional moan of wind moving through the higher branches, the startling crack of a limb breaking under snow or ice. People in Redford talked about it the way you talk about a neighbor who's always been there, mysterious but familiar. You respect his boundaries and he mostly leaves you alone. There were men and women whose whole lives orbited that forest. One of them was a forester named Frank Dwyer, who'd been in the job long enough that his face had the same lined, weathered look as the bark he spent his days leaning against. Another was a ranger by the name of Caleb Rowan. Caleb worked the eastern sector out where the terrain folded in on itself in steep ravines and narrow game trails. If you ever ran into him in town, which wasn't often, you'd notice two things right away. The way his clothes looked like they'd just been pressed, even if he'd come in from the field, and the small brass compass he wore on a cord around his neck, its case polished to a dull sheen. When he came into the station to drop off reports, he laid them on the counter in a perfect stack. Corners aligned the pages flat and uncreased. I'd dealt with Caleb on a few joint calls, lost hikers, illegal campsites, the occasional poacher, and I'd always found him competent and a little distant. He talked about the forest like it was a machine he was responsible for keeping in balance. One afternoon, months before everything that followed, I'd watched him stand at the edge of a roadside pullout, studying a pile of beer cans and fast food wrappers someone had tossed into the weeds. He didn't say anything, just looked at it for a long moment, his jaw tight, then began picking up each piece of trash with a careful, almost delicate grip like he was reassembling something that had been broken. The air that day had smelled like hot tar and pine sap, and a light wind kept pushing the wrappers just out of his reach until he caught them. I remember thinking at the time that he cared more than most people did. Life in town moved along that fall in a steady rhythm. On Saturdays, you could hear the high school marching band practicing behind the stadium, the thin, brassy sound of tubas and trumpets drifting over the wet grass. In the evenings, headlights slid along the storefronts as people made their way home, beams cutting through the low fog that gathered at the corners of the streets. Inside the Grizzly Tap, the pool balls clicked, and the jukebox coughed up old country songs, the smell of spilled beer and fryer grease clinging to everyone's clothes. At the small grocery, the automatic doors sighed open and shut, letting out quick bursts of warm, onion and detergent-scented air into the chill outside. It was a place where people recognized one another by the sound of their cough in the next aisle where any stranger stood out without even trying. In the middle of all that, Evan moved through Redford like someone passing through a frame, his presence noticed but not yet underlined. A clerk at the gas station up the hill told me later about how the photographer had stood at the pump early one morning, mist hanging low over the gravel, answering questions from a kid who wanted to learn how to take pictures. The boy remembered the way Evan had demonstrated how to angle a lens toward the tree line to catch the faint glow of sunrise through fog. How he'd talked about watching the way shadows move, not just where they fall. The kid said his hands didn't shake at all when he held the camera, that he seemed absolutely certain of what he was doing. That kind of detail sticks with you when you start trying to put a story back together from the beginning. At home, I didn't think about any of that yet. My evenings were quiet. I'd come through my front door, the hinges giving that same soft groan they'd given for 20 years, and drop my keys in the chipped blue bowl on the side table. The house smelled of whatever I'd cooked last and the faint must of damp flannel from the jacket I hung near the door. Sometimes I'd switch on the small lamp in the living room and sit in my worn armchair with a book I didn't really read, listening to the rain ticking against the windows and the distant rumble of trucks heading up toward the pass. On those nights, the forest felt close but not threatening, just a dark shape leaning against the edge of town. I do remember one evening at the office near the end of October, though, when the air in the hallway felt cooler than it should have. The heat had kicked off for some reason, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a faint, nervous flicker. I was finishing up a report when I noticed the permit file half open on the corner of my desk, that sheet of paper with the photographer's name showing through the manila like a ghost of black letters under thin skin. Outside, dusk was settling the sky, turning that deep slate color that makes the streetlights look too bright. I closed the file, slid it back into the cabinet, and locked up for the night, not thinking then that I'd be pulling that same drawer open again and again in the weeks to come. Up on the hill at the Evergreen Lodge, Jenny moved through her small routine. She walked the strip of worn carpet in the hallway, listening to the steady hum of the soda machine and the faint murmur of a television through one of the thin walls. Outside the glass door, the parking lot shone black under a steady mist, each parked car wearing a skin of water that reflected the yellow porch light. A new name had been added to the ledger for a room on the second floor, a note beside it in Jenny's handwriting. Up early for shoot. Back by evening. She glanced once more at the clock behind the desk, listening to the soft tick of its hands, and straightened the pens in their cup out of habit. The porch light burned on unwavering in the damp night, waiting for tires on gravel that for the moment she had no reason at all to doubt were coming. The first sign that something was off came early on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning when the clouds hang so low over Redford that you can't tell where the sky ends and the hills begin. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when the phone on the wall gave a single short ring, the kind that tells you the sheriff's office is calling through the internal line. The sound felt out of place in my quiet kitchen, sharp against the soft patter of rain on the window. I picked up expecting a weekend traffic mishap or maybe one of the regulars reporting a downed tree on County Road 9. Instead, it was Kellerman's voice lower than usual, asking if I was already awake and if I could stop by the office sooner rather than later. He didn't give a reason. He didn't need to. Something in the way he cleared his throat before hanging up told me the easy rhythm of the day had shifted. When I stepped outside, the cold air had a bite to it, the kind that creeps through your jacket before you've made it down the steps. The streets were quiet, slick with last night's mist, and even the ravens that usually perched on the telephone lines were nowhere in sight. I remember thinking the whole town looked like it was holding its breath. At the sheriff's office, the lights were already on. Through the glass, I could see Kellerman standing with his arms crossed, staring at the bulletin board like he was trying to make a decision he didn't want to make. The first words out of his mouth were simple. Evergreen Lodge called, he said, rubbing a thumb along his jaw. Guy hasn't checked out. Didn't come back last night. It took me a second to connect the dots. He handed me the lodge report, and there, on the top line, was the name Evan Rhodes, the photographer. At first, it didn't sound like much. People missed checkout times all the time, overslept, lost track of time, got distracted by a sunrise. But something about the way the lodge clerk had insisted on calling her voice tight, her words quick, made it clear this wasn't the usual oversight. According to her, Evan hadn't slept in the bed at all. The sheets were crisp, untouched, and his car was nowhere in sight. We drove out to the Evergreen Lodge together, the cruiser humming along the wet road, the defroster fighting the fog that kept creeping across the windshield. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, a thin curtain of mist had rolled down from the ridge above town, giving everything a muted underwater look. Jenny was waiting just inside the lobby, her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to keep them from shaking. The lemony smell of the place hit me as soon as we stepped in, warm and out of place against the cold that clung to my jacket. He said he'd be back by evening, she told us, her eyes flicking toward the hallway that led to his room. He asked about sunrise times. He seemed settled, focused. Not the kind of person who forgets where he's supposed to be. We let her unlock the room. The door swung open on a quiet space, untouched by the night. The blankets lay smooth across the bed. No muddy boots on the mat. No damp jacket hung over the back of a chair. The air inside had that still motel smell, cleaner. Old carpet, something faintly metallic from the radiator. On the nightstand sat a folded trail map and a room key he hadn't thought to pick up after leaving at dawn. If he'd come back even for a moment, there would have been some sign: an opened curtain, an empty water bottle tossed in the trash, the imprint of weight on the mattress. But there was nothing. Just an empty room and the hum of a vent pushing out lukewarm air. It wasn't until we stepped into the parking lot again that the first thread of unease pulled tight inside my chest. Evan's rented SUV was nowhere among the scattered pickups and Oregon plates. If it had been a simple case of losing track of time, he should have been driving back down from the trail by then. Dawn had broken hours ago. Photographers chase light, but they don't stay past dark without a word to anyone. Not in late October, not with weather blowing in from the mountains. Still, Kellerman tried to keep it light, probably stayed out farther than he meant to. He muttered as we got back into the cruiser. Happens all the time. But even he didn't sound like he believed it. The way he adjusted the mirror twice before backing out told me he was thinking ahead, turning over possibilities he didn't want to say aloud. We headed toward the Redford Ridge trailhead, following the winding road that climbed through the wet evergreens. The deeper we went, the colder the air felt, like we'd driven into another season altogether. Mist clung to the asphalt, curling around the tires, and the scent of wet earth drifted through the cracked window. A few fallen leaves skittered across the road ahead of us, pushed by a wind we couldn't feel. When we reached the small gravel lot at the trailhead, the first thing I noticed was the sudden quiet. No hikers' voices, no car doors, no crunch of boots on rock, just the soft tap of moisture dripping from the pines and the low rumble of the cruiser's engine. And there, parked neatly in one of the narrow spaces, sat Evan's Honda, clean locked and strangely undisturbed. I walked up to the driver's side window, the gravel shifting under my boots with a dry, crackling sound. Inside the vehicle, his extra jacket lay neatly folded over a map, and an empty water bottle rolled slightly on the floor as I leaned closer. The keys were nowhere in sight. Nothing inside the car suggested a struggle, an emergency, or a rush to leave. It looked exactly like the car of someone who planned on coming back. The wind pushed a cold draft across the back of my neck, carrying with it the scent of wet bark and the faint sweetness of decomposing pine needles. I stepped back and looked toward the trail entrance, a narrow path disappearing into the dark green shade of the forest. On any other day, I wouldn't have felt a thing standing there. But that morning, the mouth of the trail felt like a door someone had left open too long. Kellerman circled the vehicle once, then crouched to look at the ground for any obvious signs. The gravel was disturbed, but it always was: boots, bike tires, dogs. Nothing distinct, nothing helpful. He stood slowly, brushing damp pebbles from his palm. Could have taken a side loop, he said, but his voice had dropped, as if speaking too loudly might break something we didn't understand yet. From there, the day slipped into that strange kind of suspended time you only feel when you're waiting for something to walk back out of the woods. We made calls back to dispatch, checked in with the Forest Service, waited for someone to say they'd seen him at a scenic overlook or crossing the creek bed farther up the ridge. But every answer came back the same: no sightings, no conversations, no missed call logs at the motel or his phone provider. By midday, the temperature had dropped even further, and a sharper wind had begun to move through the trees, carrying with it the faint hiss of branches rubbing together. I could feel the cold settling into my sleeves as we stood by the cruiser, the air thick with the smell of cooling rain and diesel from a logging truck far down the road. Somewhere in the distance, a jay screamed its single harsh warning note. It made the hairs stand up along my arms. It was early afternoon when the call came in from Portland, a woman's voice tight and breaking. It was Laura Evans' sister. She'd been expecting to hear from him that morning, a quick check-in he always made when he was traveling alone. When he didn't call, she assumed he'd gotten busy or lost service. But something about the silence had started to gnaw at her. "He always calls," she kept saying. "Even if it's late, he always calls." I tried to steady my voice, explaining what little we knew. She went quiet for a long stretch, the only sound on the line the faint static of distance. When she spoke again, her breathing had changed, shorter, faster, like she was trying to hold herself together with sheer force. "If he's hurt out there," she said, "he would have left something behind. He wouldn't just walk away from the trail." And I knew she was right. The forest was wild, but Evan was not careless. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the shadows along the trail stretched long and thin, turning the forest into a darker, more watchful thing. I took a few steps up the path, just far enough to feel the temperature drop another degree as the canopy closed over me. The soil underfoot felt soft from the night's rain, and the air smelled of wet moss and cold minerals rising from the creek bed somewhere deeper in the woods. I called his name once, my voice swallowed almost immediately by the stillness. No echo, no movement. When I turned back, Kellerman was standing beside the cruiser with his hands on his hips, staring at the Honda like it might give him a different answer if he looked long enough. The porch light back at the lodge would be flicking on soon, shining over an empty parking space he should have been in by now. The sun was slipping behind the branches and the chill was getting sharper, settling in the spaces between my ribs like a warning. We hadn't found a broken branch or a dropped glove or a hurried footprint. But standing there in the fading light, listening to the forest breathe in the last of the day, I felt the weight of something I couldn't yet name. Something had shifted. Something quiet and unseen, but unmistakable. By the time we finally headed back to town, the sky had gone almost fully dark, the mist turning silver in the headlights. When we pulled into the lot behind the sheriff's office, a single cruiser was waiting. Engine idling, lights off. Deputy North stepped out, smoothing the front of his jacket before he approached us. Even in the dim light, I could see the way he removed his hat and held it against his chest. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The night had already told us what it could. The rest, whatever it was, lay waiting just beyond the edge of the woods. The next morning began long before the sun found its way over the ridge, and I remember the smell of wet gravel rising off the ground as I walked up to the sheriff's office. A thin line of headlights cut across the parking lot. 2 deputies' cruisers, a fire department pickup, and the Forest Service rig I recognized from Caleb Rowan's rounds. The air was cold enough that every breath came out like steam, and the coffee in my hand suddenly felt too warm, as if the day ahead already knew more than we did. Inside, the radio crackled in short bursts while Kellerman stood over the long table in the conference room, a topographic map spread out across it like a body waiting for examination. He didn't look up right away when I stepped in. He just tapped a finger on a point along the Redford Ridge Trail and said quietly, "We're making it official." That sentence carried a weight I felt in my chest. I'd heard it before fires, missing kids, backcountry rescues, but this time it settled differently. Maybe it was the empty motel bed or the neat car at the trailhead, or the fact that the air that morning felt unnaturally still, like the land itself was listening. Whatever it was, I knew the search for Evan had crossed the invisible line between a late return and something far more serious. By 6:30 a.m., the gravel lot at the trailhead was alive with movement. Flashing amber lights bounced off the wet tree trunks. Search dogs paced in tight circles as their handlers adjusted harnesses. Rangers from the Silvercrest district unloaded first aid kits, radios, and cold weather packs, their breath fogging the air as they talked through assignments. Volunteers drifted in local hikers, off-duty EMTs, a pair of teachers who spent summers in these mountains. They stood beside their trucks, tightening straps on backpacks, the soft click of buckles carrying across the clearing. I walked toward Evan's SUV, still exactly where we'd found it the day before, beads of moisture clinging to the windshield like a thin layer of frost. The chilly air seeped through the seams of my jacket as I leaned against the hood, watching the morning build itself around us. It was then, in that half-light, that I realized just how quickly this had grown beyond the quiet circle of concern we'd held the night before. The forest swallowed people now and then, but not like this. Not someone as steady, as methodical, as experienced as him. The first team moved out just after sunrise. Their radio check echoed faintly between the trees, a series of clipped tones swallowed as soon as they entered the narrow corridor of the trail. I followed a second group toward a fork half a mile in the ground, soft beneath our boots. Dew clung to the ferns, glistening like tiny glass beads. Every sound seemed amplified, the rhythmic breath of the dog ahead of us, the distant rush of the creek below, the small crack of a branch somewhere off to our right. It didn't take long before we were spread thin across the slope, each of us listening for something we couldn't quite name. As the morning dragged on, we combed through ravines where moss grew thick enough to muffle our steps, checked boulder fields where the wind hissed faintly across the rock faces, and searched along the feeder trails where hikers sometimes wandered off course. A helicopter from this next county arrived mid-morning, its rotors beating a hollow rhythm against the valley walls as it made slow, tiered passes above the canopy. I watched it drift overhead, its spotlight cutting through the mist in a pale cone that looked almost too delicate for the weight of what we were asking it to find. Maps were spread across the hoods of trucks, waxed paper wrinkling under the damp air, routes marked in red pencil. Volunteers leaned in, tracing lines with calloused fingers, their faces drawn in concentration and fatigue even this early in the effort. Every few minutes, a radio would crackle with a report, North Ridge clear. Crossing above the creek, negative. Dog picked up something. Hold on, false alarm. That phrase, false alarm, echoed too many times. Around midday, one of the canine units thought they had something. The shepherd's stiffened nose bent into the cold wind, pulling hard toward a cluster of brush along a shallow slope. My pulse kicked as we hurried over, pushing aside wet branches. But whatever trail the dog sensed faded almost immediately, as if the air itself had misplaced it. The handler knelt, rubbing the dog's shoulders, whispering praise, despite the disappointment that washed over all of us. The dog kept sniffing the soil, confused, searching for a scent that had slipped through its grip. Not long after, a volunteer radioed about a scrap of fabric near the creek. Everyone braced, waiting for the confirmation, but when I climbed down the muddy embankment with Kellerman and one of the rangers, we found that it wasn't a shirt or a hat or anything familiar. It was a torn piece of a tarp from an old campsite someone had left behind years ago, stiff with dirt and weather. The creek flowed beside us, cold and fast, carrying fallen pine needles in quick swirls. The wind off the water had a bitter bite to it, and I could feel it settling into my bones as we stood there staring at nothing useful. We checked a small fire ring up the ridge, not new, not warm, just a circle of stones blackened by someone else's story. Tracks around it were too faded to make sense of the soil churned by animals and weather long before we arrived. Everything we found seemed to belong to a different time, a different person, a different trail altogether. By late afternoon, tension settled over the search like a second fog. People spoke in lower tones, glancing more often at the tree line as if expecting something to move where nothing did. Whispered theories began to make their rounds among the volunteers. Some said he must have slipped near the creek and been carried downstream. Others blamed sudden hypothermia, early snow disorientation. A couple of locals muttered about old stories, hikers going missing near the eastern rise, places where the forest didn't like being disturbed. They said it softly, the way people talk when they don't want to be heard saying something they half believe. I didn't entertain folklore, but I did feel a shift in the air as the day wore on, a heaviness that pressed against the space behind my ribs. Every hour we worked, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if it were holding its own secrets tight. The farther we pushed into the reach of the old pines, the more I sensed a kind of watchfulness. Nothing supernatural, just the ordinary, indifferent patience of wilderness that has stood longer than any of us. A place that does not care who enters or why. The rangers exchanged looks that carried more worry than their words. They knew these woods better than anyone knew the patterns of hikers who wandered off and the typical signs left behind. This was not fitting the mold. Even Caleb Rowan, calm and particular as he was, seemed unsettled when I caught his eye near the ridge. He had a clipboard in his hand, each sheet clipped perfectly square, but his fingers tapped along its edge in a tight rhythmic pattern. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but the small tick spoke louder than words. It was near dusk when we returned to the trailhead for a short briefing. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I could feel the cold working its way through the seams of my boots. People moved slower now, fatigue setting into their faces. One volunteer stood with his hands wrapped around a thermos, steam rising into the dimming light. Another leaned against the bed of his pickup, stretching his back, the radio on his shoulder clicking with static. We gathered around the table where the maps lay weighted by stones and spare flashlights. The red pencil marks had grown into a web of zigzagged lines, each one an area we'd cleared, each one an unspoken disappointment. Kellerman rubbed his temple, squinting at the terrain contour. His voice was steady, but the strain threaded through the edges of it. He asked about water crossings, ridge slopes, any signs of travel beyond the last set of boot prints near the trail's first bend. Nothing new. Nothing certain. One of the younger deputies brought up the possibility of Evan leaving the trail to photograph something that caught his eye. A rare tree, a wildlife sign, a change in light. It wasn't far-fetched. People with cameras often wandered, pulled by their own instincts. But it didn't explain the missing clues we should have found by now: a bent branch, disturbed soil, a dropped cap from a lens. The forest had ways of covering its tracks, but it didn't erase them perfectly. Not like this. As the volunteers prepared to head back out for one last sweep before nightfall, I stood beside the fire road barrier, listening to the low hum of generators warming up and the muted thud of gear bags dropped onto tailgates. The smell of gasoline mixed with the sharp scent of wet pine, and somewhere deeper in the woods an owl started its early call, 3 long notes drifting through the trees like a warning. I felt the weight of the day in my bones, the uncertainty pressing into every thought. It wasn't the first search I'd been part of, and it wouldn't be the last, but this one had a different pull to it, a deeper quiet, a more stubborn resistance from the land. It was as if the forest was willing to let us look, but not willing to show. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the ridge when a crackle came over the radio, short, sharp, cutting through the static. I looked toward the trail entrance where the last of the orange light was slipping across the tops of the trees. A deputy was hurrying down the slope toward us, something small clasped in his hand, his breath rising in pale bursts in the cooling air. His pace was quick, purposeful, but his face stayed unreadable in the gathering dusk. He slowed as he reached the edge of the clearing, holding that object just tight enough that none of us could see what it was from where we stood. He glanced toward Kellerman, then toward the darkening trail behind him, and in that moment, a cold wind pushed through the clearing, scattering a sheet of loose pine needles at our feet. Whatever he carried, whatever he'd found, didn't fit with anything we'd seen so far, and the look in his eyes told me the night was about to take a different turn. The deputy came down the slope with that small object cupped in his hand, and even before he reached us, the air in the clearing shifted. It wasn't anything dramatic, no thunder, no sudden darkness, but something inside me settled into a deep, unmistakable stillness. Years in law enforcement teach you to recognize the difference between routine findings and the things that make a man walk a little slower, breathe a little shallower. As he approached, the radios around us crackled with short bursts of chatter, the tone sharper, now edged with urgency. People stopped what they were doing. Maps hung in midair half-folded. A volunteer's flashlight beam froze against the gravel. It felt as if the whole mountain held its breath. When he finally reached the table where we'd been gathering reports, he opened his hand just enough for us to see the dirt under his fingernails and the faint tremor in his fingers. Inside his palm lay a memory card scratched, caked with a thin crust of soil, but unmistakably intact. The world around me seemed to narrow to that one square of dark plastic. For a brief second it felt weightless, as though the answers we'd been chasing all day were about to pour out of it. Then Kellerman's jaw tensed and he called out for the area to be secured. The shift happened fast. Rangers moved to block off the slope, their boots thudding over wet earth as they repositioned themselves. Deputies took out roll after roll of bright yellow tape, pulling it tight between trees. The low hum of the generator cut off as someone hit the switch, leaving only the faint, restless hiss of the wind moving through the pine needles. A search dog barked once high and sharp and was quieted just as quickly. In the sudden stillness, the forest felt less like a backdrop and more like a dark figure watching us from every angle. We followed the deputy back up the narrow path he'd come down the ground, soft beneath our soles. The scent of wet bark grew stronger the higher we climbed, mixing with the metallic tang of cold air. The sky was slipping from gray into a bruised early evening blue. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, not fast but hard, each beat deliberate, like it was bracing for whatever lay ahead. The spot he led us to wasn't dramatic at first glance, a tangle of fallen roots and overturned earth near the edge of a shallow ravine. But something about it felt wrong. A pine long since dead and stripped of its bark lay twisted across the slope, its roots yanked from the ground like the bones of an animal that had tried to tear free. In the dark hollow formed beneath those roots, the deputy crouched again, careful not to disturb anything. He pointed his flashlight into the narrow cavity. At first I saw nothing but the glint of wet soil and the curve of a stone. But as he shifted the light, a corner of black camera housing appeared beneath a layer of dirt barely visible, as if the forest had been slowly swallowing it. It was wedged deep enough that no storm or animal could have forced it there naturally. The placement was intentional, deliberate, hidden. I remember kneeling beside that deputy, feeling the cold seeping up through my knees as I leaned closer. The air inside the hollow felt different still, almost stale, as though it had been shut off from the rest of the world. When they lifted the camera out, the casing was cracked, the screen spidered with impact marks. The strap hung in tatters. But the compartment for the memory card, sealed tight by design, had done its job. Someone had smashed the camera. Someone had buried it. Someone had wanted it lost. As they eased the camera free, a chill rolled through me, not from the temperature, but from an understanding I wasn't ready to name. The ravine around us seemed to draw in its edges, the shadows thickening beneath the trees. Behind me, one of the volunteers whispered a single word under his breath, something like a prayer or a warning. I couldn't quite make it out. We carried the camera back to the command area with a kind of reverence. Not a word was spoken on that walk, only the steady crunch of boots on gravel and the distant groan of wind moving through the high branches. Someone started the generator again, and the sudden buzz of electricity felt intrusive, almost disrespectful. The memory card was placed into an evidence bag and sealed. Then it was handed off to our tech specialist, a quiet man named Hayes, who had worked with us long enough to understand the gravity of what he was holding. He set up his laptop on the tailgate of a Forest Service truck using a lantern for light. The cold metal of the truck bed gleamed under the beam, small droplets of mist gathering around the edges. As he connected the reader, I felt a strange weight settle on my shoulders, like whatever we were about to see was something we wouldn't be able to unsee. The forest hummed around us, soft, steady, indifferent. When the first image appeared on the screen, I felt my breath hitch. It was a simple shot. A tree line on a foggy morning, pale and quiet, the kind of photograph you'd expect from someone like Evan. The next image showed a clearing, then another of moss on a fallen log. Familiar, harmless, ordinary. But after that, the pattern shifted. One tree, same angle, same light, same distance, again. A series so long and unbroken it made my chest tighten, each photo taken minutes apart, each frame nearly identical. The longer I stared, the more unreal it felt, like watching a heartbeat tapped out over and over by a hand that had no choice but to obey. I heard someone behind me inhale sharply. Another stepped back, boots scraping against the gravel. My own pulse slowed, settling into a heavy, stunned rhythm. I had seen difficult things in my career: accidents, crime scenes, moments where evil made itself visible. But this was different. There was something cold in the repetition, something deliberate, something coercive. As the last of the sequences loaded, the final photo flickered onto the screen, blurry, tilted sky filling half the frame as if the camera had been knocked loose. At the bottom left corner, just barely visible in the enhanced light of the monitor, was the faint curve of a gloved hand reaching across the lens. A silence settled over the group that felt absolute. The kind of silence that lands only when a truth becomes undeniable. The camera had not broken on its own. The photos had not been taken willingly. And somewhere beyond that last frame, beyond the reach of the lens, someone had been standing with Evan. The sheriff stepped forward, jaw clenched tight enough that I could see the muscle twitch. He spoke quietly, his voice low and steady, but the words were heavy. This was no longer a missing person call. This was a crime. And the forest around us, once just a place of trails and fog and indifferent beauty, now felt like a witness that wasn't ready to talk. Within minutes, the scene shifted again, more tape, more boundaries, additional lights brought in from the trucks. Deputies contacted the state crime lab, and someone radioed the FBI liaison we occasionally worked with on complex cases. Hayes was instructed to save copy and secure every image, no matter how slight the variation. A ranger set markers along the path where the deputy had found the car, driving them into the ground with a rubber mallet, whose hollow thuds echoed along the slope. As all this unfolded, I felt a kind of numbness wash through me, as if my mind were trying to keep a boundary between what I was seeing and what it meant. My breath came shallow. My hands felt colder than they should have. The trees swayed in a slow, almost rhythmic motion, and for a strange, fleeting second, I felt like the forest itself was mourning something it couldn't undo. Word traveled quickly. Laura arrived shortly after dusk, escorted by a deputy. Her face looked drained in the harsh beam of the floodlights, her breath catching when she saw the evidence bags lined up on the hood of the nearest cruiser. She didn't ask to see the photos. She didn't need to. Her shoulders fell in a way that made my chest ache, and she leaned against the side of the truck like her legs might give out. A ranger quietly draped a blanket around her. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped further. Our breath rose in white plumes as we worked. The ground beneath our feet became slick with frost, and the sounds around us carried farther than they should have. The clink of metal clasps, the soft murmur of officers conferring, the thump of gear being moved. Somewhere down the slope, a deputy slipped and caught himself sending a spray of loose earth down into the ravine. The sound echoed like a warning shot. By the time the additional units arrived from the neighboring county, the forest beyond our perimeter had grown pitch black. Only the tight pockets of artificial light kept the darkness from swallowing the entire ridge. I stood near the search table, hands in my pockets, watching the outline of the fallen pine in the distance. It looked like a dark, jagged scar against the hill, an exposed rib of the earth that had kept it secret as long as it could. We worked until our backs stiffened and our eyes blurred. Evidence was logged, statements taken, boundaries expanded. At one point, Kellerman pulled me aside. His voice was low, steady, but there was a weariness to it I hadn't heard in years. "This changes everything," he said. And he was right. The discovery had ripped the veil off whatever story lay out there in the trees. When we finally returned to the sheriff's office, the windows glowed with the kind of pale yellow light that means people are still inside long after they should have gone home. Press inquiries had already begun trickling in through dispatch. A conference room was being prepped with extra chairs. In the hallway, I could hear someone typing fast, the keys clicking in frantic bursts. I paused beside my desk, the weight of the day settling into my bones. Outside, the night was still, too still, and as I stood there listening to the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead, I knew the next hours would bring questions none of us were ready to confront. The kind that change the course of a case. The kind that don't let you sleep after you hear the answers. The truth had finally started to surface, and there was no going back. The hours after we pulled that camera from the earth moved in a kind of slow, echoing rhythm, as though the world around us had slipped into a different gear. Word spread through the department faster than any of us could keep up with. And by dawn the next morning, every hallway in the sheriff's office hummed with movement. Radios buzzed, printers spat out forms, and the scent of burnt coffee drifted through the air like a thin, bitter fog. Officers from neighboring counties arrived in unmarked sedans, their boots leaving wet tracks across the tile. Everyone understood, even without saying it, that we weren't dealing with a simple disappearance anymore. Something darker had taken root out there in the woods, and now we were staring straight into it. Laura sat in the conference room, hands wrapped around a cup of water she never lifted to her lips. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, blinking slowly as though each breath cost her something. When I stepped inside, she gave a small nod, a gesture that felt heavier than any words. I sat beside her close enough that my shoulder brushed hers, hoping the small contact might anchor her in a room full of strangers. But the truth was, I needed that anchor too. For all my years of seeing the worst people could do, I'd never grown used to watching someone realize the world they knew was gone. By midday, the FBI's evidence transport arrived, black cases lifted out of the trunk with gloved hands, each labeled in block lettering. The camera, the memory card, the fragments of casing, all of it went into those cases sealed tight. It was strange how final that click sounded when they shut them. It felt like a hinge closing between the life we'd known and the one we were stepping into. The town reacted the way small communities always do when something unthinkable breaks the surface. Some folks brought casseroles to the station as though warmth could soften the sharp edges of what we'd found. Others stood outside in clusters, voices low, glancing toward the tree line as though expecting it to stare back. A few whispered theories that didn't make sense but made them feel less powerless, and some just stayed indoors with their blinds half drawn, keeping to themselves until they understood how close danger had come. Within days, the arrest was made. It wasn't dramatic, no lights, no chase, just the steady creak of boots on a porch and a man opening his door with a stillness that chilled me. I'd seen guilt before in a dozen shapes. Sometimes it was frantic, sometimes defensive, but this was something else. A quiet acceptance, a sense of someone who believed he'd acted within rules that no sane person could recognize. When the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his gaze toward the woods behind his house like he was checking whether something he'd built was still standing. The trial months later carried its own cold air. I sat in the back row, hands folded the wood of the bench pressing into my spine. Families filled the room, the weight of their grief nearly tangible. The prosecutor laid out the case piece by piece, each detail falling into place like stones in a path none of us wanted to follow. When the verdict finally came, it didn't bring celebration or relief, just a long, hollow quiet. Justice had been written on paper, but the ache in that room had far deeper roots. Life in town shifted in ways you couldn't see on a map. The trail where we found the first signs of Evan's last day grew quieter. Hikers still came through, but their steps were slower, more cautious, as though the forest itself held a memory they could feel but not name. People locked their doors earlier. Some families who'd lived here for generations packed up and moved closer to relatives in other states. Even the air around the ranger station felt different, careful, a little wounded. For me, the change came in quieter moments. I'd wake before sunrise, long before I needed to, and stand at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand. The sky would be that early gray blue that looks almost like old paper, and I'd think about the places we walked during those long days of searching. I could still smell the damp moss, still feel the cold weight of silence pressing in from all sides. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening for the faint click of a camera shutter, the kind Evan used to let echo through the trees. That sound had always struck me as peaceful. Now it carried a different weight. Laura stayed in town for several months after the trial. She'd stop by the station occasionally, more to sit in familiar company than to talk about the case. She'd bring old photos of Evan Him standing by a riverbank at 17, his hair still long. Him kneeling in the brush to capture a bird mid-flight. In each picture he had the same look in his eyes, that quiet reverence for the world around him. I used to think I understood it. Now I wondered if any of us really had. The trail where we'd begun our search eventually reopened, though the sheriff recommended people stay on the main path. A small wooden bench was placed near the entrance, carved by a local craftsman who said it felt like the right thing to do. On the backrest, burned clean into the wood, were a few words about Evan's love for the forest. Folks still sit there from time to time, letting the breeze run through the branches overhead. It's a peaceful spot, but there's an undertone to it, a reminder of how thin the line can be between beauty and danger, even in places we've walked our whole lives. As the years passed, the case settled into the fabric of our town the way all tragedies eventually do, not forgotten, not forgiven, but absorbed. Some parts of it softened, worn down by time. Others stayed sharp. On certain autumn mornings, when the fog settles low in the valley and the trees stand like tall silhouettes, I feel that familiar tightness in my chest. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. A sense that some stories stay with you no matter how far you walk. I think often about the day we found the camera, how the cold air stung my skin, how the quiet around us seemed to hold every breath, how one small object could shift the entire course of so many lives. When I look back now, what lingers most isn't the shock or the fear or even the grief. It's the understanding that truth doesn't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it crawls into view slowly, piece by piece, like a photograph developing under dim light. I still visit that trail from time to time. Not to search, not to investigate, just to stand in the place where everything changed. The forest looks the same as it always did, but when the wind moves through the branches, there's a faint whisper to it. A reminder. A presence. And every now and then, just for a moment, I think I hear the soft echo of a shudder beneath it all, as if the trees themselves remember. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.